A dog invades a hospital and stops a risky surgery for a boy. In the operating room of Mercy General Hospital in the bustling city of Chicago, the medical team froze at the unusual scene. A mutt with orange fur had managed to bypass all security and was now on the operating table, positioned between Dr. Michael Richards' scalpel and little Matthew, just 9 years old. The dog stared at the surgeon with a determined look, as if it understood exactly what was about to happen. The animal's eyes seemed to say, "Don't touch him." The team tried unsuccessfully to pull the dog away from the boy, but the closer they got, the more the mutt bared its teeth, protecting the unconscious child. "Can someone explain how the hell this dog got into my operating room?" asked Dr. Michael, arms raised, still holding the sterilized scalpel. Head nurse Jennifer Smith shook her head, just as baffled as everyone else in the room. "I don't know, doctor. I've never seen anything like this in 20 years on the job." Dr. Michael glanced at the heart monitor beside the table. Matthew's vitals were stable, despite his delicate condition. The preliminary diagnosis indicated a congenital heart defect requiring immediate intervention. According to the tests, without surgery, the boy could face serious complications. "Call security," he ordered, never taking his eyes off the dog, "and find out who owns this animal. He's putting the patient's life at risk." Outside the operating room in the waiting area, Mrs. Margaret Wilson, Matthew's grandmother, paced back and forth. At 72, she had raised her grandson ever since her daughter died in a car accident 3 years earlier. Her wrinkled hands fidgeted with her rosary as she murmured prayers. Beside her, sitting in one of the blue plastic chairs, Joseph, the boy's grandfather, held a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him taking a single sip. "I told you, Joseph," Mrs. Margaret said, pausing her anxious pacing. Something was wrong. Rusty was restless all night, barking toward Matthew's room. That dog senses things. Joseph waved his hand as if swatting a fly. "Margaret, for heaven's sake, don't start with those stories." The dog probably heard some noise outside. The elderly woman's face hardened. "It's not a story. You saw how the boy was this morning, and now he's in there being cut open by the doctors." Just then, a nurse hurried out of the operating room. Spotting the elderly couple, she approached with a puzzled expression. "Are you the guardians of Matthew Wilson?" Mrs. Margaret stepped forward, her heart tightening. "We're his grandparents. Did something happen?" she asked, already feeling her legs weaken. "Did you by any chance bring a dog to the hospital? A yellowish mutt?" Joseph jumped up, knocking his coffee cup to the floor. "Rusty? No, he's at home, locked in the backyard. Why?" The nurse stared at them in disbelief. "Because there's a dog just like that stopping the surgery. He jumped onto the table and won't let anyone near the boy." Mrs. Margaret covered her mouth with her hands, while Joseph turned pale. "But that's impossible. Our house is over 3 kilometers from here." Inside the operating room, the situation remained tense. The dog, now identified as Rusty, stood firm in his position, growling at anyone who tried to approach Matthew. Dr. Michael, still in sterile gloves, checked the clock on the wall. Time was running out, and the surgery couldn't be delayed. "Doctor," called Dr. Rebecca Johnson, the resident physician assisting with the case, "the boy's grandparents are outside. It's their dog, but they say it's impossible for him to have come here." The surgeon furrowed his brow. "Nothing is impossible in this world, Rebecca. Animals have instincts we can't explain. But we need to handle this. Ask them to come in and try to calm the dog. We can't sedate the animal with the patient in this condition." Outside, as they waited for permission to enter, Mrs. Margaret Wilson gripped her husband's arm tightly. "Joseph, I told you. Rusty sensed something was wrong. Matthew's been complaining of chest pains for 3 days, and the doctors only listened when he fainted at school. But Rusty knew before." The elderly man rubbed his tired face. The bond between his grandson and the dog had always been something he couldn't explain. Matthew had found Rusty on the street when the dog was just a puppy, abandoned, in a cardboard box on a rainy day. Since then, they'd been inseparable. "The question now isn't how he got here, Margaret. It's why he's stopping the surgery. These doctors know what they're doing." "Do they?" the old woman questioned, doubt flickering in her eyes. "Remember my brother Anthony? The doctors swore he needed heart surgery, but it was just an arrhythmia. That was controlled with medication. Before Joseph could answer, the nurse returned. Dr. Michael Richards has authorized your entry. We need you to calm the dog so the surgery can proceed. The boy's condition is serious. We can't waste time. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. When they entered the surgical center properly suited up, Mrs. Wilson and Joseph were shocked by the scene. Rusty, who should have been in their backyard, was there on the operating table, his paws positioned exactly over Matthew's chest, right where the doctors intended to make the incision. "Rusty," Joseph called firmly, "get down from there, boy." The dog looked at his owner but didn't move an inch. His brown eyes seemed to plead for understanding. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward slowly. "Dr. Richards, before we take Rusty away, may I ask a question?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Are you absolutely certain my grandson needs this surgery?" The doctor, visibly frustrated with the situation, took a deep breath. "Mrs. Wilson, all the tests point to a congenital heart defect. Without surgical intervention, your grandson could face serious complications." "We've already explained this." The old woman looked at the dog, then at her unconscious grandson and back at the doctor. "It's just, Rusty's never been wrong, doctor. Never." She hesitated for a moment. "My husband thinks it's silly, but when my daughter was pregnant with Matthew, the neighbor's dog would whimper every time it got near her. 3 days later, we found out she had high blood pressure during the pregnancy, if we hadn't caught it in time." "Ma'am," the doctor interrupted, "with all due respect, we can't base medical decisions on an animal's behavior. The tests are clear." It was then that Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who had been silently observing, stepped forward. "Dr. Richards, I know this may sound strange, but what if we run one more test, a color Doppler echocardiogram? Recent studies show some conditions can mimic heart defect symptoms, especially in children." The doctor stared at the young resident, ready to reprimand her for questioning his authority in front of the family. But something in Dr. Johnson's determined gaze made him reconsider. "Do we have time for this?" he asked, glancing at the monitors. "His vitals are stable. We can do the test in 15 minutes. She hesitated for a second. "Doctor, Michael, remember that case at University Medical Center last year? The girl who almost had unnecessary surgery?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Dr. Richards remembered the case well. A 14-year-old girl nearly underwent invasive heart surgery, but an attentive intern noticed a discrepancy in her blood tests. It turned out she had a rare metabolic condition that mimicked heart problem symptoms. 15 minutes, he finally agreed. But if the test confirms the original diagnosis, we won't waste any more time. As they prepared Matthew for the new test, with Rusty finally allowing the doctors to approach, though refusing to leave the boy's side, Mrs. Wilson watched the dog with admiration. "How did you end up here, Rusty? How did you know?" Joseph, who always considered himself a practical and rational man, was starting to wonder the same thing. The distance between their home and the hospital wasn't short, and there were several busy streets along the way. How had that dog not only found his way, but also bypassed hospital security to locate the exact room where his grandson was about to have surgery? While Matthew was taken to the exam room, closely followed by Rusty, which the doctors decided to tolerate given the animal's insistence, Dr. Richards pulled Dr. Johnson aside. "What exactly are you thinking, Rebecca?" he asked quietly. The resident hesitated for a moment. "Doctor, Matthew's blood work shows some subtle changes that aren't typical of congenital heart problems, and the family history. His grandmother mentioned her brother had something similar. Are you suggesting a hereditary condition? Possibly. There are some rare metabolic syndromes that can affect heart function without necessarily requiring surgery. Medication might be enough." The doctor fell silent for a few seconds, processing the information. In his 20-year career, he'd learned that sometimes medicine wasn't as exact as he wished it were, and occasionally, unexplained events, like a dog breaking into a hospital, served as warnings for something science hadn't yet noticed. "Let's see what the test shows," he finally said. "If there's any doubt, we'll consult a specialist before proceeding." In the hallway, while waiting for the new test results, Mrs. Wilson held Rusty in her lap, stroking his fur. "This dog is worth his weight in gold," she murmured to Joseph. "Remember when Matthew had that high fever last year? Rusty didn't leave his side for a minute." Joseph nodded, recalling how he teased his wife at the time for saying the dog was looking after their grandson. "Margaret, do you think it could be the same problem your brother had?" he asked worriedly. "Who knows, Anthony had the same symptoms. The doctors wanted to open his chest, but Dr. Mitchell, God rest his soul, insisted on more tests. In the end, it was a metabolic issue affecting his heart. He lived another 20 years on medication." Their conversation was interrupted when Dr. Johnson appeared in the hallway, followed by Dr. Richards. Both wore serious expressions, but there was something different in the older doctor's gaze, a mix of surprise and relief. "Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Wilson," Dr. Richards began. "We've done the Doppler echocardiogram and re-evaluated the previous blood tests." He paused. Dr. Johnson was right. While there is an anomaly in Matthew's heart structure, it's not a malformation requiring immediate surgery. Mrs. Wilson's legs weakened and she leaned on her husband. "What does he have then?" "The new tests suggest a hereditary metabolic syndrome affecting heart function. It's rare but treatable with proper medication." The doctor cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Actually, surgery could worsen his condition. Joseph felt a shiver run down his spine. If they had gone through with the operation, "Does this mean he doesn't need surgery?" he asked, still in disbelief. "Exactly. We'll start a medication regimen and monitor him closely, but there's no need for surgical intervention." Mrs. Margaret Wilson hugged Rusty tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "I knew it. I knew this dog was trying to tell us something." She looked at the doctor. "You have to admit, Doctor, it's a miracle this dog showed up here today." Dr. Michael Richards, a man of science through and through, would normally dismiss any explanation that defied logic. But at that moment, faced with an elderly woman, clutching a mutt who in some inexplicable way had prevented a potentially fatal surgery, he couldn't disagree. Sometimes, Mrs. Wilson, medicine must recognize its limits. He glanced at Rusty, who was now wagging his tail as if he understood his mission was complete. And yes, it was extraordinary. In the days that followed, the story of the dog who barged into the operating room to save his owner spread throughout the hospital. Nurses, doctors, and even patients asked to meet Rusty, who now had special permission to visit Matthew during his recovery. Dr. Rebecca Johnson, inspired by the case, decided to deepen her studies on rare metabolic disorders, particularly those affecting the cardiovascular system. Dr. Michael Richards, in turn, became more cautious in his diagnoses, always seeking alternatives before recommending invasive procedures. As for Matthew, after starting the correct treatment, he showed clear signs of improvement. His episodes of fatigue and chest pain decreased significantly, and he could finally run and play like any child his age. One sunny afternoon, 2 weeks after the incident, Mrs. Margaret Wilson sat on the porch of her modest home in Bridgeport, watching Matthew play in the yard with Rusty. The boy threw a ball which the dog eagerly chased, displaying an energy and joy that had seemed impossible weeks before. "Just look at them," she said to Joseph, who joined her with 2 cups of coffee. "Who would have thought we'd be here seeing our boy run like this?" Joseph handed his wife a cup and sat beside her. "You know, Margaret, in all my life I never put much stock in that sixth sense intuition, those stories you always told." He paused to take a sip of coffee. "But after what happened, how do you explain it?" Mrs. Margaret smiled, a serene smile of someone who'd always known there were more mysteries in the world than reason could explain. "You don't need to explain, Joseph. Some things you just feel." In the yard, Matthew called his grandparents to see a new trick he'd taught Rusty. The dog sat on his hind legs, front paws raised as if begging. It was the exact position he'd taken on the operating table, over the boy's chest. "Look!" Matthew exclaimed proudly. "I didn't even train him to do this. He learned it on his own." Mrs. Margaret and Joseph exchanged meaningful glances. Some coincidences were too hard to ignore. That night, after putting Matthew to bed, with Rusty faithfully curled up at his feet, the elderly couple received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Rebecca Johnson stood at the door, holding a folder of documents. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said as Mrs. Margaret invited her in. "But I thought you'd want to know. I found 3 more cases similar to Matthew's at other hospitals in Chicago. Children with the same symptoms who nearly underwent unnecessary surgeries." Joseph offered the doctor a chair while Mrs. Margaret Wilson prepared more coffee. "And what happened to those children?" the elderly man asked. "2 of them had attentive doctors who noticed the discrepancies in their tests in time." She paused. "The 3rd wasn't so lucky. She was operated on and had serious complications." A heavy silence fell over the room. The realization of what could have happened to Matthew was too painful to put into words. "Why are you telling us this, doctor?" Mrs. Wilson asked, returning with a cup of coffee for their visitor. Rebecca accepted the drink with a silent thank you before answering. "Because I believe we need to improve our diagnostic protocols, and because—" She hesitated. "Because sometimes we need to acknowledge that not everything in medicine can be explained by the science we know today." The doctor pulled out her phone and showed the couple a photo. It was an image from the hospital's security cameras showing Rusty entering through the parking lot, unnoticed among ambulances and doctors' cars. "I spoke with security. He got in when the emergency room's automatic door opened for an ambulance. After that, somehow, he found his way straight to the surgical center where Matthew was." She put her phone away. "In a hospital with 5 floors and dozens of hallways." Joseph, ever the skeptic, felt a chill. "How could he have known?" Rebecca smiled. "That's the question, isn't it? How could he have known? Science would say it was a coincidence or that he followed Matthew's scent, but you know it was more than that," Mrs. Wilson finished. "That dog loves my grandson, and somehow he knew." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. 3 months had passed since the incident at the hospital. Life in the Wilson household had settled back into a quiet routine. Matthew was responding well to treatment, attending school as usual and only needing monthly checkups. Rusty remained the boy's loyal protector, though now he was treated with special reverence by everyone in the family, even by Joseph, who had started setting aside the best pieces of meat for the dog during meals. One Wednesday afternoon, as Matthew did his homework at the kitchen table with Rusty lying at his feet, the phone rang. Mrs. Wilson answered. "Hello?" After listening for a moment, her face paled. "Yes, he's here." "Yes, we'll bring him right away." Joseph, who'd been reading the paper in the living room, noticed the change in his wife's tone and came over. "What's wrong, Margaret?" The elderly woman hung up with trembling hands. "It was Dr. Johnson. She wants to see Matthew urgently. It seems the latest test results showed something concerning." Joseph's heart clenched, just when everything seemed to be going so well. "Did she say what it was?" "She didn't want to explain over the phone. She asked us to bring him to her office today." As the grandparents hurriedly prepared, tense and worried, neither noticed that Rusty remained perfectly calm, still lying at Matthew's feet, showing no sign of agitation. In Dr. Johnson's office, the doctor greeted them with a serious but not alarmed expression. She asked Matthew to wait outside with a nurse so she could speak with his grandparents first. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," she began as soon as the door closed, "I've reviewed Matthew's test results and found something important." "Is it serious?" Mrs. Wilson asked, gripping her husband's hand tightly. "Actually, it's the opposite." A faint smile appeared on the doctor's face. "The metabolic syndrome markers are almost back to normal. The medication is working better than we expected." Joseph let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "But why the urgency? Why scare us like that?" Dr. Rebecca Johnson's expression grew serious. "Because it's not just about Matthew. We've identified 7 similar cases in the area. Children with the same condition, all misdiagnosed with heart problems that would have required surgery." "My God," murmured Mrs. Margaret Wilson. "And those children—" "We managed to stop the procedures in time thanks to Matthew's case." She opened a file on her computer. "Look, after what happened with your grandson, I published a detailed report in the integrated hospital system. Doctors have started paying closer attention to this possibility of misdiagnosis." Joseph leaned forward, intrigued. Are you saying Matthew's case, our grandson's, is saving other children? Exactly. The doctor leaned back in her chair. And that's why I called you in urgently. We're organizing an awareness event on rare metabolic diseases in children, and we'd like you to share your experience, especially, she hesitated, especially the part about Rusty. Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened. You want us to talk about the dog, but won't the doctors laugh at us? Rebecca smiled. Mrs. Wilson, the hospital security footage showing a mutt barging into the operating room has already made the rounds among the doctors. No one's laughing. Many are intrigued, some are impressed, and everyone's curious. She paused. Besides, this story humanizes medicine. It reminds all of us that sometimes we need to listen to more than just what the machines tell us. The grandparents exchanged glances, processing the request. The idea of speaking in public scared them, but if they could help other families avoid what almost happened to Matthew. And Rusty? Joseph asked unexpectedly. Can he come too? Dr. Rebecca laughed. Actually, he's the guest of honor. As they left the office, promising to attend the event the following month, they found Matthew in the waiting room, quietly playing a game on his phone. Beside him, lying on the floor as if it were the most natural place in the world, was Rusty. How did he get here? Joseph asked, confused. We left him at home. The nurse accompanying the boy looked equally baffled. He just showed up, sir. Came in through the door when another patient left. Went straight to Matthew's side like he knew exactly where to find him. Mrs. Wilson knelt down despite her aching knees and hugged the dog. Rusty, you little rascal, how do you do these things? The dog just wagged his tail, looking at her with those brown eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any human could comprehend. On the drive home, with Matthew asleep in the back seat and Rusty keeping watch beside him, Joseph broke the silence. You know, Margaret, I always thought you were exaggerating when you talked about animals having a sixth sense. He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was thick with emotion. But after all this, I don't know what to think anymore. Mrs. Wilson smiled, watching her grandson and the dog in the rearview mirror. Don't overthink it, Joseph. Just accept that there are things in this world we can't explain. And sometimes a faithful heart, even a dog's, sees what human eyes can't. The following week, Dr. Rebecca organized a meeting with doctors from Mercy General Hospital and representatives from other medical centers in the region. The central theme: how to avoid rush diagnoses in complex pediatric cases. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Michael Richards, who was previously known for his inflexibility and absolute trust in protocols, took the floor. Colleagues, he began with unusual humility, we work in a profession where we must rely on science, tests, and protocols, but recently I had an experience that made me question whether, at times, we might be overlooking something important, observing the small things, the subtle signs, the intuitions. A murmur spread through the room. It was uncommon to hear Dr. Richards, known for his pragmatism, speak about intuition. 3 months ago, I nearly operated on a 9-year-old boy suspected of having a congenital heart defect. The initial tests pointed to it, and the protocol was clear: immediate surgical intervention. He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. Had we gone down that path, the boy likely wouldn't be with us today. At best, the surgery would have been useless. At worst, fatal. The room fell completely silent. The doctor rarely spoke about cases that hadn't gone well, much less admitted possible mistakes. What made us stop and reconsider wasn't a new test, the opinion of a renowned specialist, or a newly published scientific paper. He looked at each person present. It was a mutt that somehow got into the operating room and positioned itself between my scalpel and the patient. Reactions ranged from shock to disbelief, but no one interrupted. I know it sounds absurd. I would have laughed at this story if someone had told me, but it happened. And thanks to this unexpected event, we had time to run additional tests that revealed the patient's true condition, a rare metabolic syndrome that mimicked the symptoms of a congenital heart defect. The doctor then projected a series of test results on the screen, explaining the subtle differences between the markers of the metabolic syndrome and those of typical heart problems. He showed how, by paying attention to details and taking a broader perspective, it was possible to distinguish them. Since then, we've identified 7 more similar cases in our region, 7 children who nearly underwent unnecessary invasive procedures. His gaze swept the room. How many more might be out there in other hospitals awaiting surgeries that could be avoided? The presentation lasted over an hour, with Dr. Richards detailing new diagnostic protocols that included specific tests for the metabolic syndrome in question. At the end, Dr. Rebecca Johnson spoke up. Next month, we'll be holding an awareness event for families and healthcare professionals. The grandparents of the patient we mentioned have agreed to share their experience. She smiled. And yes, the dog will also be there. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room, but the overall mood was thoughtful. The more experienced doctors exchanged pensive glances, while the younger ones took detailed notes. After the meeting, Dr. Richards and Dr. Johnson were walking down the hospital hallway when they were approached by Dr. Helen Carter, the hospital director, a woman known for her focus on results and efficiency. "Michael, Rebecca," she called, her tone a mix of professionalism and concern. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" The 3 stepped into a small, empty meeting room. The director closed the door and turned to them. "I heard about your presentation, about the dog incident." Dr. Richards straightened his shoulders, ready to defend his stance. "Helen, I know it sounds unusual, but the facts are undeniable. That child didn't need surgery, and I know," she interrupted, surprising both doctors. "Actually, I'm here to thank you." Dr. Johnson and Dr. Richards exchanged puzzled glances. "Thank you?" the surgeon repeated. "Yes?" Helen sat down, inviting them to do the same. "You know our hospital has been facing financial difficulties in recent years. The pressure for efficiency, for more procedures performed, for shorter patient stays, all of this has taken us away from what truly matters, caring for each patient." She opened a folder she had brought with her. "I reviewed data from the last 2 years. We've performed 27% more pediatric cardiac surgeries than the national average for a hospital of our size." Her eyes met Dr. Michael Richards. "This could mean we're exceptionally good at diagnosing heart problems, or that we're overdiagnosing." The silence that followed was heavy. The implication was clear and painful. "I'm not saying there was bad faith," Helen continued, "but perhaps we've let ourselves be swayed by the pressure for results, by over-reliance on rigid protocols, by the lack of time to consider alternatives." She closed the folder. "Starting today, we're implementing a new policy. Any major pediatric surgery will require evaluation by at least 3 independent specialists before approval." Dr. Rebecca Johnson couldn't suppress a small smile of satisfaction. "What? About the awareness event?" she asked. "Do we have your approval to proceed?" "Not only do you have my approval, but you'll also have my full support." Helen stood up. "In fact, I'd like to meet this extraordinary dog in person. And the family, of course." When the 3 of them left the room, Dr. Michael Richards seemed thoughtful. "You know, Rebecca," he said, as they walked back to their respective offices, "in over 20 years of medicine, I never thought my greatest lesson in diagnosis would come from a mutt." The young doctor smiled. "Sometimes, doctor, the best lessons come from the most unexpected places." In the weeks leading up to the awareness event, Rusty's story spread among the hospital staff and gradually reached the local media. A neighborhood newspaper ran a small article titled "The Dog Who Knew More Than the Doctors," which caused some discomfort among the medical community, but also piqued public curiosity. Mrs. Margaret Wilson, initially uneasy about the attention, eventually embraced her role as a spokesperson for their experience. She and Joseph visited other hospitals in the area, sharing their story with doctors, nurses, and parents of hospitalized children. Rusty, always well-behaved, accompanied them, receiving affection and attention wherever they went. On the day of the main event, the auditorium at Mercy General Hospital was packed. Families with children, healthcare professionals, representatives from rare disease organizations, and even some journalists filled the seats. In the front row, Matthew waited eagerly alongside his grandparents and Rusty, who wore a special collar with a small badge identifying him as guest of honor. Dr. Rebecca Johnson opened the event, explaining in simple terms the metabolic syndrome affecting Matthew and other children, and how it could be mistaken for heart problems. Then Dr. Michael Richards took the stage, visibly nervous. Performing a high-risk surgery was easier than speaking to a packed auditorium. Good morning, everyone. As doctors, we're trained to trust science, tests, and concrete evidence, and that's essential. Evidence-based medicine has saved countless lives throughout history. He paused. But the case we're sharing today reminds us that sometimes we need to be open to other forms of wisdom, to other kinds of warnings. He then recounted step by step what had happened that morning in the operating room, how everything was prepared for a routine heart surgery on a 9-year-old boy, and how the intervention of a mutt completely changed the course of events. If we had proceeded with the original plan, based solely on the initial tests, the outcome could have been catastrophic. His voice wavered slightly. But thanks to a series of unlikely coincidences, or perhaps they weren't coincidences, after all, we got the chance to re-evaluate the diagnosis and discover the patient's true condition. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. When it was Mrs. Margaret Wilson's turn to speak, she waved off the microphone they offered her and used her strong retired teacher voice, honed over decades of managing noisy classrooms. My grandson Matthew is 9 years old, she began, pointing to the boy in the front row. He found Rusty 3 years ago, abandoned in a cardboard box during a storm. Since then, that dog has been more than just a pet to our family. He's been a protector, a friend, and as we recently discovered, even a doctor. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. I know it sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. But the truth is that dog knew. She looked directly at the crowd. The 2 nights before Matthew fainted at school, Rusty didn't sleep. He paced the house, barking at the boy's room, restless. I told my husband something was wrong. But I didn't believe it, Joseph finished, standing to join his wife. I've always been a practical, rational man. A dog's a dog, people are people, I used to say. Until the day this backyard mutt broke the kitchen window, ran 5 kilometers to the hospital, slipped past security at one of the city's biggest medical centers, found the exact room where my grandson was about to be operated on, and stopped the scalpel from touching him. He paused, visibly emotional. After that, I had to rethink everything I thought I knew about the world. The audience was utterly silent, absorbing every word. We're not here to say doctors should replace tests with dogs, Mrs. Wilson continued, drawing a few more laughs. We're here to remind everyone that sometimes the most important signs come from unexpected places. For us, it was a dog. For other families, it might be a persistent gut feeling, a doubt that won't go away, a piece of information that doesn't quite fit the diagnosis. Joseph nodded. What we learned is that we need to be heard. We, the family, know our loved ones better than anyone. And if we feel something isn't right, even if we can't explain exactly what it is, well, maybe it's worth looking into a little further. Dr. Michael Richards took over again, explaining how Matthew's case had led to identifying several other similar cases and how new diagnostic protocols were being implemented, not just at Mercy General Hospital, but at other medical centers in the region. At the end of the presentation, they opened the floor for questions. A pediatrician raised her hand. This is all very moving, but how do we apply this lesson in practice? We can't just delay procedures every time a family member expresses doubts or a pet acts strangely. It was Dr. Helen Carter, the hospital director, who answered. The point isn't to dismiss science in favor of intuition, but to create space for different sources of information to be considered. She walked to the center of the stage. At our hospital, we've developed a new protocol that includes a step called inconsistency verification. Before proceeding with any invasive procedure on children, the medical team must take time to carefully listen to family members, note any observations that seem contradictory to the proposed diagnosis, and consider alternative diagnoses, even when the primary one seems well established. Matthew, who had been following along with varying interest, as expected from a 9-year-old boy, asked to speak. With some hesitation, Dr. Rebecca handed him the microphone. I just wanted to say that Rusty is the best dog in the world, he said with the straightforward simplicity of children. "And he's really smart too. He knows when I'm going to get sick before I even know. One time he ate my homework and I got really mad, but the next day the teacher said she'd given us the wrong assignment and we had to do it all over." "Again," he shrugged. "I think he knew that too." The audience laughed, charmed by the boy's sincerity. Then, to everyone's delight, especially the children present, Rusty was brought on stage. The golden-coated mutt walked with dignity, as if he perfectly understood the role he was playing at that moment. He obediently sat in the center of the stage, looking at the audience with those intelligent brown eyes. "This is Rusty," introduced Dr. Michael with a smile few of his colleagues had ever seen. "The dog who taught me to be a better doctor." After the event, as people dispersed, many stopped to pet Rusty and take photos. Journalists tried to interview Mrs. Margaret and Joseph, fascinated by the unusual story. Matthew, tired of all the attention, had retreated to a quiet corner of the lobby, playing with his handheld game. That's where Dr. Michael found him, sitting down beside him. "Hey, champ, tired of all the excitement?" The boy looked up from his game and nodded. "A little. But it's okay. Grandma says it's important to tell our story to help other kids." The doctor smiled. That was exactly how he felt himself. "You know, Matthew, I wanted to thank you." "Me?" The boy seemed genuinely surprised. "I didn't do anything. It was Rusty who did everything." "Not exactly. You found Rusty when he needed it most. Gave him a home, love, care. If it weren't for you, he wouldn't have been there that day to stop me from making a serious mistake." Matthew considered this for a moment, with the surprising wisdom children sometimes show. "You were just doing what you thought was right, Doctor. You wouldn't have done anything wrong on purpose." Dr. Michael felt a lump in his throat. The innocent absolution of a 9-year-old shouldn't mean so much to an experienced doctor like him, and yet, still thank you. And when you grow up, if you still want to be a doctor like you told me during our appointments, remember this lesson, okay? Sometimes we need to look beyond tests and textbooks." The boy nodded solemnly, then his face lit up as he saw Rusty, approaching, finally free from the crowd of admirers. "Look who's here!" he exclaimed, putting away his game to greet his friend. The dog trotted over, first sniffing Matthew from head to toe, as if checking that everything was all right, then sitting between the boy and the doctor, looking from one to the other as if following the conversation. "He always does that," Matthew remarked. "Watches when people talk, like he understands everything." Dr. Michael smiled, stroking the dog's head. "Maybe he does understand, Matthew. Maybe he understands more than we realize." In the months that followed, life continued its course. For the Wilson family, Matthew returned to school full-time, now completely free from the episodes of fatigue and pain that had troubled him before. The medication for his metabolic condition was working perfectly, and the doctors were optimistic that with proper follow-up, he could live a perfectly normal life. Rusty, in turn, had become a minor celebrity in the neighborhood. People recognized him on the street when Matthew took him for walks, and many stopped to pet him and share how they'd heard his incredible story. The dog accepted all the attention with calm dignity, as if it were no big deal to have stormed into a hospital and stopped a surgery. One Saturday afternoon, while Matthew played in the backyard with some school friends, Mrs. Margaret Wilson received an unexpected visit. It was Dr. Rebecca Johnson, accompanied by a woman she didn't know. "Mrs. Wilson, I hope I'm not disturbing you," the doctor said after the initial greetings. "This is Michelle Sanders, mother of John Peter, one of the boys we identified with the same condition as Matthew." The middle-aged woman beside Rebecca had red eyes, as if she'd been crying recently. "Nice to meet you," Mrs. Wilson said, extending her hand. "Please, come in. Joseph just made fresh coffee." In the simple but cozy living room, with family, photos on the walls and an old television in the corner, Michelle seemed nervous, holding her coffee cup with trembling hands. I just wanted to thank you in person," she finally said, her voice breaking. "My John Peter was scheduled for surgery last week. If you hadn't shared Matthew's story, if the doctors hadn't run those extra tests." She couldn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. The meaning was clear in her teary eyes and the way she squeezed Mrs. Wilson's hand. "There's no need to thank us, my dear," the elderly woman replied. "It was God's will that our Rusty was there, that day. And if it helped your boy too, we can only be happy. Rebecca watched the scene with quiet emotion. Over the past few months, her work had taken on new meaning. What had started as a medical hunch based on subtle details in test results had become a real mission to identify and properly treat children with that specific metabolic syndrome. Actually, she said as the conversation shifted to lighter topics, I have one more piece of news to share. Mercy General Hospital is creating a specialized unit for rare metabolic diseases, with a particular focus on conditions that can mimic heart problems. She smiled at Mrs. Wilson. And we'd like to name it the Rusty Unit. The elderly woman brought her hands to her face, overcome with emotion. Good heavens, they're honoring a mutt. A mutt who saved many lives, Rebecca corrected, and who reminded us of an important lesson we sometimes forget in the rush of daily life, the importance of stopping, observing, and listening to the less obvious signs. At that moment, as if aware he was the topic of conversation, Rusty walked into the room, followed by Matthew and his friends. The dog went straight to Michelle, sniffing her curiously, before resting his head on her knee and looking up at her with those expressive eyes. Surprised, the woman stroked the dog's head. So this is the famous Rusty, she murmured, the hero of my John Peter without even knowing it. Matthew, watching the scene, puffed up with pride. He's the best dog in the world, he declared, with the absolute conviction only children possess. And now everyone knows it. As the adults talked and the children returned to their games in the backyard, Rusty took his usual spot, lying in a strategic spot in the house where he could observe everything happening around him. His watchful eyes followed everyone's movements, especially Matthew's, always vigilant, always protective. Mrs. Margaret Wilson, observing the dog, couldn't help but think about how full of surprises life was. Who could have imagined that? The abandoned puppy Matthew had found 3 years earlier would not only change their lives but also the lives of so many other families. And who knew how many more would be helped in the future, thanks to the Rusty Unit. A few weeks later, Dr. Michael Richards, who had become a regular visitor at the Wilson household, brought surprising news during a Sunday lunch. Do you remember that medical article I wrote about Matthew's case? He asked as Mrs. Wilson served him another spoonful of rice. It's been accepted for publication in the American Journal of Pediatric Cardiology. And not just that, I've been invited to present it at an international conference in Boston. Joseph raised his glass in a toast. Congratulations, Doctor. I told you this story would go far. The doctor smiled, still amazed at how that seemingly bizarre incident had turned into a respected medical case studied by specialists. I'm thinking of focusing my career in this field from now on, he confessed. Rare metabolic diseases affecting the cardiovascular system. There are far more cases than we realize, and very little specific research. Matthew, who had been listening while sneaking pieces of chicken to Rusty under the table, much to Mrs. Wilson's silent despair, as she pretended not to see, looked up. When I grow up, I want to be a doctor just like you, Dr. Richards, and I'm going to discover all the diseases nobody knows about yet. The adult smiled at the boy's determination. Who knew? Maybe that experience had truly planted a seed in his heart. If you study hard, I'm sure you'll be an excellent doctor, Matthew, Dr. Richards replied, and you'll always have an incredible story to tell your patients about how a dog once saved your life. The boy looked at Rusty, who had abandoned the chicken and was now staring intently at him, as if understanding every word of the conversation. I'll never forget, Matthew said solemnly, and I'll always listen to what animals have to say, even when they don't use words. Dr. Richards nodded, equally serious. That's a lesson many experienced doctors take a lifetime to learn, Matthew, and some never do. After lunch, while Joseph and Dr. Richards chatted on the porch and Mrs. Wilson tidied the kitchen, Matthew took Rusty for a walk around the neighborhood. It was something they often did on weekends, a routine they both enjoyed. Along the way, they passed the park where other dog owners gathered. An elderly man walking a chocolate Labrador recognized Rusty immediately. Well, look who's here, the heroic hospital dog, he exclaimed, approaching with his own dog. My granddaughter's a nurse at Mercy General, you know. She told me all about what happened. Unbelievable. Matthew smiled proudly as the man bent down to pet Rusty. Your dog is very special, son, the man continued. They say some animals have a gift, a sensitivity we humans have lost over time. My grandfather had a horse that refused to leave the stable when a storm was coming, even with the sky completely clear. Never got it wrong once. He stroked Rusty's head, and the dog accepted the gesture with dignity. This one has that gift, doesn't he? Matthew nodded thoughtfully. He always knows when something's about to happen. Even before I fainted that day, he was trying to tell me something was wrong. And did you understand what he was trying to say? The boy lowered his eyes, a little embarrassed. No. I thought he was just being annoying, wanting more attention. The man smiled kindly. Don't blame yourself, son. We humans are like that. Always rushing, worried about 1,000 things, and we end up missing the signs right in front of us. He looked at his own dog. But they're always paying attention, always watching. As they continued their walk, Matthew reflected on the man's words. It was true. He often dismissed Rusty's odd behaviors as just mischief or dog quirks. But now, after everything that had happened, he promised himself he'd be more attentive. After all, Rusty had risked his life to save him, crossing busy streets and entering a hospital full of people who could have caught or even hurt him. I'll never ignore you again, Rusty, the boy promised, kneeling to hug the dog. Never again. The mutt licked his face, as if sealing that promise with a wet kiss. The next morning, a sunny Monday, Matthew was getting ready for school when he noticed Rusty acting strangely again. The dog was restless, pacing back and forth by the kitchen door, occasionally looking outside and barking. The boy's heart raced. Was this another warning? "Grandma," he called, worried. "Rusty's acting. Just like that day. Is something wrong?" Mrs. Margaret Wilson, who was packing her grandson's lunch, studied the dog carefully. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart? Any pain? Dizziness?" Matthew quickly checked himself and shook his head. "I'm fine. Nothing feels off." His grandmother stepped closer, placing a hand on his forehead. "No fever." She glanced at Rusty, still agitated. "Maybe he's trying to tell us something else." Just then, commotion erupted outside. Neighbors shouted and the sound of sirens grew closer. Joseph, who'd been watering plants in the backyard, rushed in through the back door. "There's a fire at Mrs. Mary's house, 3 doors down. The stove exploded." Mrs. Wilson covered her face with her hands. "Oh, Lord, that poor woman. She lives alone, doesn't she?" "Yes, and she's very elderly. The neighbors are trying to help, but the door's locked from the inside and there's thick smoke coming out." Matthew looked at Rusty, now barking insistently at the door. "Grandpa, do you think Rusty was trying to warn us about the fire?" Joseph, who'd grown more open to the idea of the dog having special abilities since the hospital incident, considered it. "Could be, son. Animals have sharper senses than we do. He probably smelled the smoke before any of us." As they spoke, Rusty suddenly stopped barking. Instead, he began scratching at the door intensely, clearly wanting out. "He wants to go there," Matthew said. "I think he wants to help." Mrs. Wilson, ever cautious, hesitated. "I don't know if that's a good idea, sweetheart. The fire department's coming. They know what to do, and fires are dangerous." Before she could finish, Joseph, in a move that surprised everyone, including himself, opened the door. "Go on, Rusty. Show us what you want to do." The dog bolted outside, racing toward the burning house, with Joseph and Matthew following at a safe distance. Mrs. Wilson, after a moment of shock, grabbed the phone to call emergency services and confirmed the firefighters were on their way, then hurried after her family. Outside Mrs. Mary's house, a small crowd of neighbors stood helplessly as smoke poured from the windows. The fire wasn't yet visible from outside, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. "Did anyone get inside?" Joseph asked a neighbor. "Yes, the door is locked and the windows are too small. The firefighters are on their way," but he didn't need to finish. Everyone knew that in a fire, every minute counted. Rusty, without hesitation, ran to the back of the house. Matthew followed him, ignoring his grandparents' calls. In the backyard, the dog began digging furiously at a specific spot near the wooden fence. "What is he doing?" asked Mrs. Margaret Wilson, who had caught up with her grandson. Matthew watched for a moment and then understood. "He's trying to get under the fence. Look, Grandma, there's a gap there." Indeed, there was a spot where the fence didn't quite reach the ground, leaving a small opening. Rusty was digging to widen it, clearly determined to get into the neighbor's yard. "Matthew, don't let him go in there. It's dangerous," warned Joseph, joining them. But it was too late. With one last effort, Rusty managed to squeeze through the small tunnel he dug, entering Mrs. Mary's yard. "Grandpa, we have to go after him," Matthew pleaded. "What if he gets hurt?" Joseph looked at his grandson, then at the gap in the fence and made a decision. "You stay here with your grandmother, I'll go after him." Before Mrs. Wilson could protest, the elderly man was already crouching down, trying to squeeze through the opening Rusty had widened. It was harder for him than for the dog, of course, but after a few moments of effort and some scratches, he made it into the neighbor's yard. The smoke was thicker here, pouring out of the back windows of the house. Joseph covered his nose and mouth with his arm, scanning the area for Rusty. He spotted the dog frantically scratching at a small glass door leading to the kitchen. "Rusty, come back here," he called, moving carefully closer. The dog glanced back for a moment, as if asking for help, then resumed scratching the door. Joseph understood. He wanted to get inside the house. "This is crazy," the old man muttered to himself, approaching the door. He tested the knob, and to his surprise, it turned. It wasn't locked. This was likely how Mrs. Mary went out to tend to her plants. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that entering a burning house was extremely dangerous, especially for someone his age. But his gut told him Rusty knew what he was doing, just as he had at the hospital. "I hope I don't regret this," he whispered before partially opening the door. Immediately a wave of smoke escaped, making him cough and step back. Rusty, however, didn't hesitate. He darted inside as soon as there was enough space. Outside, Matthew watched with his heart in his throat, while Mrs. Wilson quietly prayed beside him. "Grandma, what if Grandpa gets hurt? What if Rusty doesn't come back out?" The elderly woman squeezed her grandson's shoulder, trying to convey a confidence she didn't feel. "Your grandfather is stubborn, but he's no fool. And Rusty, well, he's surprised us before, hasn't he?" Inside the house, visibility was nearly zero due to the smoke. Joseph crouched low where the air was slightly clearer and tried calling for Rusty and Mrs. Mary. There was no response from the elderly woman, but he heard barking coming from what seemed to be the living room. Following the sound, he found Rusty beside Mrs. Mary, who lay unconscious on the floor. The dog was licking the woman's face, trying to wake her. Joseph didn't waste time. Kneeling beside her, he checked and found she was still breathing, though with difficulty. The smoke was growing thicker by the second. "Mrs. Mary! Mrs. Mary!" he called, gently tapping her face. There was no response. Joseph knew he had to get her out quickly, but he also knew he couldn't carry her alone. His nearly 70 years and bad back wouldn't allow it. "Now what, Rusty? What do we do?" As if understanding the question, the dog ran to the back door, barking insistently. Joseph understood. He needed help. Hesitant to leave Mrs. Mary alone, but realizing he had no choice, Joseph followed the dog to the back door, where he shouted for help. "Is anyone there? We need help. Mrs. Mary is inside, unconscious." Within seconds, 2 younger neighbors and a firefighter who had just arrived rushed to the back of the house. Seeing Joseph, they immediately grasped the situation and went inside to help. "Sir, you need to get out," said the firefighter as the neighbors prepared to carry Mrs. Mary. "You've already inhaled too much smoke." Joseph nodded, coughing violently. Rusty stayed by Mrs. Mary's side as the men carefully lifted her. "The dog too, sir," insisted the firefighter. But Rusty didn't move until Mrs. Mary was being carried out. Only then did he follow the group, keeping his eyes fixed on the elderly woman. Outside, an ambulance was already waiting. Matthew and Mrs. Margaret ran to Joseph as soon as he emerged, hugging him tightly. "You stubborn old man," exclaimed Mrs. Margaret, tears in her eyes. "You could have gotten hurt." Joseph, still coughing, just smiled weakly. "Had to help Rusty, didn't I?" He knew what he was doing. The paramedics quickly placed an oxygen mask on Mrs. Mary and loaded her into the ambulance. To everyone's surprise, Rusty tried to climb in too, only giving up when Matthew held him back by his makeshift leash. "Easy, buddy. She'll be fine. The doctors will take care of her now." While the firefighters battled the blaze, which Fortunately, was confined to the kitchen and hadn't spread much. A paramedic approached to examine Joseph. "You've inhaled a lot of smoke too. We'll take you to the hospital for evaluation." "No need, I'm fine," Joseph protested, but a coughing fit betrayed his words. "Grandpa, please," begged Matthew. "Go with them. Grandma and I will follow soon with Rusty." Reluctantly, Joseph agreed. Before getting into the ambulance, he knelt with difficulty and hugged Rusty. "You saved another life today, you rascal. Who would have thought, huh? A backyard mutt turned hero." At Mercy General Hospital, the same one where Matthew had nearly undergone surgery months earlier, Joseph was examined and released after a few hours of observation and oxygen treatment. Mrs. Mary, however, had to stay hospitalized due to severe smoke inhalation and minor burns on her arm. When the Wilson family visited her the next day, accompanied by Rusty, who now had special permission to enter the hospital thanks to his fame, they found her sitting in bed, chatting with Dr. Rebecca. "Look who came to visit," the doctor exclaimed upon seeing them. "And they brought the hero of the day." Mrs. Mary, a white-haired woman with a gentle face now marked by soot stains, reached out to Rusty, who approached cautiously, sniffing her. "So this is the famous dog who came into my room?" she asked, her voice hoarse from smoke irritation. "The firefighters told me everything. If it weren't for him and Mr. Joseph, I wouldn't be here." "Actually, it was all Rusty's doing," Joseph explained, still embarrassed by all the praise. "He started acting strange this morning, barking toward the street. When we heard about the fire, he practically dragged us there. And he was the one who found you." Mrs. Mary smiled, stroking the dog's head as he now allowed her touch. "I'm not surprised. I've always believed animals have a sixth sense. My late husband had a German shepherd who once warned him about a gas leak, scratching insistently at the basement door." While the adults were talking, Matthew watched Rusty with pride and admiration. His dog, the mutt he had found abandoned in a cardboard box, had not only saved his own life but also that of a neighbor. It was almost too much for a 9-year-old boy to process. Dr. Rebecca, noticing the boy's expression, sat down beside him. "You know, Matthew, there's something very special about Rusty," she said softly. "It's not just that he seems to sense when someone's in danger. It's his devotion, the way he risks himself to protect not just you, but anyone who needs help." Matthew nodded solemnly. "He's my best friend, and I think he likes helping people. That makes me think," the doctor continued, watching as the dog now accepted a cookie from Mrs. Mary's hands. "Have you ever heard of therapy dogs?" The boy shook his head. "They're dogs trained to visit hospitals and nursing homes to keep sick or lonely people company. They bring comfort and joy." She paused. "I've been talking to the hospital board. After everything that's happened, we're thinking of starting an animal visitation program, and we'd like Rusty to be our first official therapy dog." Matthew's eyes widened. "Really? Rusty would work at the hospital?" "Not exactly work," Rebecca laughed. "He'd come a few times a week with you or your grandparents to visit patients, especially the children. Many of them are scared in the hospital, and a friendly dog can make all the difference." Matthew looked at his grandparents, who were listening with interest. "Can we, Grandma? Please?" Mrs. Margaret smiled. "If the doctor thinks Rusty has what it takes, why not? It would be a good way to give back for all the good that's happened to us." In the following weeks, Rusty went through basic socialization training to ensure he was ready to interact with patients of all ages and conditions. To everyone's surprise, he adapted perfectly to the role, showing a natural patience and gentleness. His first official visit as a therapy dog was to the pediatric wing of Mercy General Hospital, where children with chronic illnesses spent long periods. Matthew proudly accompanied him, telling the story of how the dog had saved his life. In one room, they met a girl about 7 years old with a rare illness that had kept her hospitalized for months. Her name was Sophie, and according to the nurses, she rarely smiled or interacted with visitors. "Sophie, look who came to see you," the nurse said as Matthew and Rusty carefully entered the room. "This is Rusty, the dog everyone's been talking about, and this is Matthew, his owner." The girl, pale and fragile, just looked at them without much interest. "Hi, Sophie," Matthew greeted her, a little nervous. It was his first time participating in the visitation program. "Rusty heard you've Been here a long time and wanted to meet you. Rusty, as if understanding the situation, slowly approached the bed and rested his muzzle on the edge, looking at the girl with those expressive eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. To everyone's surprise, Sophie reached out and gently stroked the dog's head. "He's handsome," she said in a voice so quiet they could barely hear. "Do you want him to get on the bed with you?" Matthew asked. "He's very well behaved." The nurse hesitated, eyeing the dog with some apprehension, but finally nodded. "Just for a little while, then." With permission granted, Rusty carefully climbed onto the hospital bed, settling beside Sophie, who timidly wrapped her arm around his neck. What happened next surprised even Matthew, who was already used to his dog's special abilities. Sophie began to speak. First, just a few words whispered into Rusty's ear, then full sentences telling the dog about her illness, how she missed home, and how tired she was of taking medicine. The nurse moved to quietly explain to Matthew that this was the first time in weeks Sophie had spoken so much. As they were leaving, Dr. Rebecca Johnson, who had observed the interaction from a distance, approached Matthew and Mrs. Margaret Wilson, who was accompanying him that day. "Did you see what happened in there?" she asked, visibly impressed. "Sophie is one of our most difficult patients. She practically gave up communicating after receiving her diagnosis. None of our psychologists have been able to get her to open up like this." Mrs. Wilson smiled, stroking Rusty's head. "This dog has a gift, Doctor. I think he knows when someone is suffering, and somehow he reaches them in a way we humans can't." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "I agree, and it makes me think perhaps his role here could be even greater than we initially imagined." In the months that followed, Rusty became a regular presence at the hospital. His visits were no longer limited to the pediatric wing. He also visited elderly patients in geriatrics, those recovering from difficult surgeries, and even people undergoing cancer treatment, bringing comfort and, in some inexplicable way, hope. The most remarkable case, however, came unexpectedly, nearly a year after the original incident in the surgical center. It was a Wednesday afternoon, a normal visiting day for Rusty. Matthew, now 10 years old, had just gotten out of school and was walking with his grandfather and the dog through the familiar hospital hallways, greeting nurses and doctors who knew them well. As they passed through the neurology area, a doctor they had never seen before approached them hurriedly. "You're Rusty's owners, right? The therapy dog?" she asked, urgency in her voice. Joseph nodded, concerned by the doctor's tone. "Yes, that's us. Is something wrong?" "No, quite the opposite." She knelt to Rusty's level, studying him carefully. "I have a patient, a very complicated case, a 12-year-old boy who's been in a coma for 3 months after an accident. We were starting to lose hope, but yesterday when your dog walked down the hallway, we noticed something unusual on his heart monitors." Matthew and Joseph exchanged surprised glances. "What exactly?" the older man asked. "A change in his brain pattern, small but definite. As if something had reached the boy, even in his unconscious state." The doctor straightened up, looking slightly embarrassed for suggesting something so unscientific. "I know it sounds strange, but we'd like to try a directed visit. Bring Rusty into Lucas's room, our patient, and see if there's any reaction." Matthew immediately nodded. "Of course, Rusty can help." Joseph, always more cautious, hesitated. "Doctor, I don't want to give false hope. We know Rusty is special, but I understand your concern, Mr. Wilson, and believe me, I'd usually be the first to doubt something like this. But we've tried every medical approach available for Lucas. If there's even the slightest chance..." Joseph looked at his grandson, then at Rusty, who was watching the conversation with that calm attentiveness he always showed when something important was happening. "All right, we can try." The doctor, whose badge identified her as Dr. Rachel Miller, neurologist, led them to a room at the end of the hallway. Before they entered, she explained the situation in more detail. "Luke suffered a severe head trauma in a car accident. His parents died in the same crash." She lowered her voice so Matthew wouldn't hear everything. "Physically, he's recovering well, but his brain sustained significant damage. There's brain activity, which is a good sign, but he isn't responding to external stimuli." Inside the room, they found a dark-haired boy lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and equipment. A middle-aged woman, introduced as Luke's aunt and now his legal guardian, rose from her seat beside the bed as they entered. "These are the Wilsons and Rusty," Dr. Rachel Miller introduced, "the dog I mentioned." The woman, her eyes red from weeks of crying, studied Rusty with a mix of hope and skepticism. "Do you really think he can help?" Before any of the humans could respond, Rusty approached the bed, examining the unconscious boy with an almost palpable intensity. After a few seconds, to everyone's surprise, the dog placed his front paws on the edge of the bed and gently licked Luke's hand. "Normally we wouldn't allow this," the doctor remarked, but made no move to stop him. Rusty, as if knowing exactly what he was doing, climbed onto the bed and lay beside the boy, resting his head on Luke's chest right over his heart. The adults held their breath, expecting someone to scold them for allowing a dog, no matter how clean or well-trained, onto a critical patient's bed. But the only nurse in the room simply watched, fascinated. It was Matthew who broke the silence, pointing to one of the monitors. "Look, something's different there." Dr. Miller hurried over, studying the brainwave readings. Her usually composed professional face showed astonishment. "There's increased activity in the temporal lobe," she murmured, adjusting her glasses. "To be sure. It's subtle, but it's definitely not random." Luke's aunt stood, moving closer to the bed. "What does that mean? Is he hearing, feeling?" "It's possible," the doctor replied cautiously. "The temporal lobe is associated with sensory and emotional processing. He might be reacting to the dog's presence, the warmth, the contact." As they spoke, Rusty remained still, his eyes fixed on the boy's face as if communicating something none of the humans could understand. Then it happened. So subtle, almost no one noticed. A slight movement in Luke's right fingers, so small it could have been dismissed as an involuntary twitch. But Rusty noticed. The dog immediately lifted his head, looking at the boy's hand, then let out a single soft bark, almost a whisper. Dr. Miller rushed forward, taking Luke's hand. "Luke? Luke, can you hear me? If you can, try moving your fingers again." For a long moment, nothing happened. The flicker of hope began to fade. Maybe it had just been a random reflex after all. But then, slowly and deliberately, Luke's fingers curled, lightly squeezing the doctor's hand. His aunt gasped, bringing her hands to her mouth. "Oh my God, he's responding!" Dr. Miller maintained her professional composure, but her eyes shone. "Luke, if you can hear me, blink once." After a few seconds, the boy's eyelids fluttered and briefly closed. "He's coming back," the doctor said, her voice thick with restrained emotion. "We need to run more tests, call the team, but he's definitely responding to external stimuli now." As the doctor hurried out to get reinforcements, Luke's aunt approached Joseph and Matthew, tears streaming freely down her face. "How can I ever thank you? 3 months. 3 months waiting for any sign, and now—" Joseph smiled, also moved. "No need to thank us. It was all Rusty." He glanced at the dog, who remained lying beside Luke, now gently licking the boy's face. "That dog has a gift none of us can explain." In the weeks that followed, Luke's recovery astonished the medical team. Though he still had a long road ahead with intensive therapy and possible trauma-related after-effects, he had woken from the coma and was responding well to treatment. Rusty became a regular visitor in his room, always greeted with a faint but genuine smile. The connection between the boy and the dog was palpable, something that transcended medical or scientific explanations. Luke's case, combined with previous ones, caught the attention of the national medical community. Articles were published, debates held, and Mercy General Hospital became a leader in animal-assisted therapy, with the Rusty program serving as a model for other institutions. One Sunday afternoon, about a year and a half after the original incident in the operating room, the Wilson family gathered at their home for a special lunch. Along with Mrs. Margaret Wilson, Joseph and Matthew, Dr. Rebecca Johnson, and Dr. Michael Richards, who had become close family friends, were present, as well as Mrs. Mary, fully recovered from the fire, and to everyone's surprise, Luke now walking with the aid of a cane, accompanied by his aunt. It was a celebration, not just of everyone's recovery, but of something greater, harder to define. A celebration of unexpected connections, second chances and everyday miracles. While the adults chatted on the porch, Matthew and Luke played ball with Rusty in the backyard. The dog, now nearly 6 years old, was as energetic and attentive as ever. "Your dog is amazing," Luke remarked, watching Rusty chase the ball. His speech was still slightly slurred, a lingering effect of the trauma, but improving every day. "You know, there's something I've never told anyone." Matthew looked at his new friend, curious. "What?" Luke hesitated, as if afraid it might sound strange. "When I was, asleep for so long, I don't remember much. It's all dark, like a dream you forget when you wake up." He paused. "But I remember one thing, a golden light warm like the sun and a bark very far away calling me back." Matthew glanced at Rusty, who had returned with the ball and now watched them intently, as if following the conversation. "You think it was him, that somehow you heard him barking?" Luke shrugged. "I don't know, sounds crazy, right? But my aunt says it was the day he first came to visit that I started waking up." He smiled. "I'd rather believe it was him, that he's the one who brought me back." By the end of the evening, when everyone had left and the house settled back into its quiet routine, Joseph found Mrs. Margaret on the porch, watching Matthew and Rusty play in the yard. "What's on your mind, dear?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Just how life takes its turns, Joseph." She smiled, leaning back in the rocking chair. "Remember when Matthew brought that soaked puppy home? You wanted to send him away." Joseph laughed, recalling that rainy day 3 years earlier. "And you insisted the boy needed a friend, that it would be good for him to have someone to care for after losing his mother." He paused. "As usual, you were right." Mrs. Margaret took her husband's hand, squeezing it gently. "That day we thought we were saving an abandoned dog. But in the end it was him who saved us, all of us one way or another." In the backyard, as if sensing he was the topic of conversation, Rusty stopped playing and looked at the elderly folks on the porch. His eyes, always expressive, seemed to hold a wisdom beyond human understanding. "You know what I think, Margaret?" said Joseph, returning the dog's gaze. "I think some angels have 4 paws." End of story. Dear listener, if Rusty's story touched your heart, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Your companionship means so much to us. Do you believe animals have that sixth sense? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't miss our next heartwarming stories.